In the scorching heart of the Arizona desert, where dust devils dance across forgotten highways and the sun bleaches everything it touches, an impossible encounter would shatter the boundaries between worlds. Jake Mitchell, a down-on-his-luck ranch hand with barely enough money for his next meal, never imagined that one desperate act of courage would transform him from a nobody into the center of the most extraordinary event in human history. When he stumbled upon a creature that shouldn't exist bleeding, terrified, and surrounded by armed pursuers, he had seconds to make a choice that would change everything. What he witnessed that night beneath the desert stars defied every law of nature he'd ever known. But the real mystery began the morning after, when every radio, television, and electronic device in his small border town suddenly transmitted the same cryptic message in a language no human had ever heard. The message wasn't random. It was a warning, and it was meant for him. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast ocean of sand and stone that swallowed the horizon whole. Jake Mitchell's pickup truck rattled down Highway 191, its engine coughing like a dying man, the odometer long past 300,000 miles. The dashboard thermometer read 108 degrees, but Jake knew it felt hotter than that. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and the broken air conditioning unit mocked him with its silence. He'd been driving for 6 hours straight, returning from a cattle auction in Tucson, where he tried and failed to sell the last 3 head of cattle from the ranch that was no longer his. Jake was 34 years old, but the desert had aged him prematurely. Deep lines creased his sun-darkened face, and his hands were calloused from years of hard labor that had yielded little reward. His father's ranch, the only home he'd ever known, had been foreclosed on 3 months ago. The bank had been merciful enough to give him 60 days to clear out, but mercy didn't pay for food or gas. Now he lived in his truck, picking up odd jobs where he could find them, always moving, never settling. Just another piece of human driftwood rolling across the American Southwest. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that would have been beautiful if Jake had the luxury of appreciating beauty anymore. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Just a stale breakfast burrito from a gas station outside Phoenix. His wallet contained exactly $37, barely enough to fill his tank and maybe buy some canned beans if he was lucky. As he drove, Jake's mind wandered to his father, dead now for 2 years from a heart attack that the doctor said was sudden, but Jake knew had been coming. His father had worked himself into an early grave, trying to keep the ranch afloat during the drought years, watching helplessly as the cattle died and the wells ran dry. Jake had tried to continue his legacy, but some battles couldn't be won with determination alone. Sometimes the world just ground you down until there was nothing left but dust. The radio crackled with static. The only station this far from civilization was a Navajo language program that came and went depending on the atmospheric conditions. Jake reached forward to turn it off when something caught his eye in the distance. At first, he thought it was a heat mirage, the kind that made the asphalt shimmer and create phantom lakes on the horizon. But as he drove closer, he realized it was real, a plume of black smoke rising into the darkening sky, maybe 2 miles off the highway. Jake's first instinct was to keep driving. Whatever was happening out there wasn't his problem, and he had enough troubles of his own. But something made him slow down, an old instinct from his days running cattle when you always checked on things that looked out of place. Smoke in the desert usually meant a vehicle fire, and that could mean someone was hurt or stranded. Out here, that was practically a death sentence if help didn't arrive before nightfall. He pulled off the highway onto a dirt access road that led toward the smoke. The truck bounced violently over ruts and rocks, suspension squeaking in protest. The smoke grew thicker as he approached, and Jake could now see flames dancing in the distance. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just a small fire. This was something big. As he crested a small rise, the scene below froze him in place. In a shallow basin surrounded by red rock formations, a vehicle, if you could call it, that was burning fiercely. But it wasn't any vehicle Jake had ever seen. The craft was roughly triangular, maybe 20 feet across, made of some kind of metallic material that seemed to shift colors in the firelight. It had crashed nose first into the desert floor, creating a crater of disturbed earth and shattered rock. Debris was scattered everywhere, pieces of unknown technology smoking and sparking. But that wasn't what made Jake's breath catch in his throat. Surrounding the crashed craft were 4 black SUVs arranged in a semicircle, and standing in front of them were at least a dozen men in tactical gear, armed with military-grade weapons. They weren't firefighters or emergency responders. They looked like a private military unit, all wearing matching black uniforms with no visible insignia, and running desperately through the rocks, trying to escape, was something that made every rational thought in Jake's mind simply stop functioning. The creature was roughly humanoid in shape, but clearly not human. It stood about 6 feet tall, with elongated limbs and movements that were too fluid, too graceful to be natural. Its skin appeared to be covered in fine scales that shimmered with an iridescent green-gold pattern, catching the dying sunlight like a reptile's hide. The head was distinctly alien larger than a human's, with enormous dark eyes that dominated the face, and a mouth that seemed too wide. It was injured, moving with a pronounced limp, and Jake could see dark purple blood streaming down one leg. The armed men were pursuing it systematically, spreading out to cut off escape routes, moving with professional precision. They weren't trying to kill it, Jake realized with a chill. They were trying to capture it. The creature stumbled, fell, and scrambled behind a large boulder just as the men closed in. Jake should have driven away. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to put the truck in reverse and get back to the highway. This was government business, black ops stuff, the kind of thing that regular people weren't supposed to see and definitely weren't supposed to interfere with. Getting involved would only bring trouble, the kind of trouble that made people disappear. But Jake had stopped listening to self-preservation a long time ago. What did he have to lose? His ranch was gone. His family was gone. His future was a slow decline into poverty and irrelevance. And looking at that creature hiding behind the rock, bleeding and terrified, Jake saw something he recognized, the desperation of a living thing that had run out of options and was about to be captured by forces it couldn't fight. He made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. Jake grabbed a loaded shotgun he kept behind the seat, Remington 870 that had belonged to his grandfather, and kicked open his truck door. Jake moved quickly down the slope, using the rocks and sparse desert vegetation for cover. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline flooding his system in a way it hadn't in years. The tactical team was focused on the creature, which meant they hadn't noticed his truck on the ridge above. He had maybe 30 seconds of surprise, if he was lucky. The creature was pressed against the boulder, its chest heaving with rapid breaths. Those enormous eyes were scanning frantically for an escape route that didn't exist. 3 of the tactical team members were approaching from different angles, weapons raised, while others held back providing cover. One of them was speaking into a radio, his voice too distant for Jake to make out the words. Jake positioned himself behind a large rock formation about 40 yards from the scene and shouldered his shotgun. His hands were steady. Years of hunting had taught him how to control his breathing, how to make his body obey even when his mind was screaming with fear. He aimed at the ground about 10 feet in front of the nearest tactical operator and squeezed the trigger. The boom of the shotgun echoed across the desert like thunder. Dust and rock fragments exploded where the shot struck, and the tactical team immediately wheeled toward this new threat, weapons tracking. Jake pumped another shell into the chamber and fired again, this time over their heads, the sound alone enough to make several of them duck instinctively. "Federal agent!" Jake shouted, his voice carrying authority he didn't actually possess. "Stand down and identify yourselves." This is Bureau of Land Management property, and you are operating without authorization." It was a complete bluff, and Jake knew it wouldn't hold up for more than a few seconds. But those few seconds were all he needed. The creature, demonstrating intelligence that confirmed it was far more than an animal, immediately understood it had been given an opportunity. It bolted from behind the boulder, moving with surprising speed despite its injury, heading directly toward Jake's position. The tactical team commander, a man with sergeant's stripes on his uniform, shouted orders. "Neutralize the civilian. Lethal force authorized. Do not let the asset escape." Gunfire erupted. Jake threw himself behind the rock as bullets ricocheted off stone, sending chips of shrapnel flying. He could hear the distinctive crack of assault rifles M4S probably, or something similar. These weren't security guards or rent-a-cops. These were trained military operators, and Jake had just made himself their target. The creature reached Jake's position, skidding to a stop behind the same rock formation. Up close, it was even more otherworldly than Jake had realized. The scales covering its body were intricate, each one a tiny hexagon that shifted through colors like oil on water. Those enormous eyes completely black without any visible whites fixed on Jake with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. There was unmistakable intelligence behind those eyes, a consciousness that was evaluating him, judging him, trying to understand why this human had intervened. "Come on," Jake shouted, gesturing toward the ridge where his truck was parked. The creature's head tilted in a distinctly reptilian motion. Then it actually nodded in understanding. Whatever this being was, it understood human gestures. They ran together, Jake firing his shotgun periodically behind them to keep the tactical team at bay. The creature moved faster than him despite its injury, occasionally looking back to make sure Jake was keeping up. Bullets kicked up dirt around their feet. Jake's lungs burned with exertion, and his legs felt like lead. But fear and desperation drove him forward. They crested the ridge and reached the truck. Jake yanked open the passenger door, and the creature, showing remarkable adaptability, climbed inside, folding its elongated limbs awkwardly into the human-sized space. Jake threw himself behind the wheel, turned the key, and for one heart-stopping moment, the engine coughed and sputtered. The tactical team was charging up the slope, less than 50 yards away. "Start, you piece of—" The engine roared to life. Jake slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator, sending the vehicle fishtailing wildly as the tires fought for purchase on the loose dirt. Bullets punched through the rear window, shattering it completely. Safety glass exploded into the cab. Jake ducked instinctively while wrestling with the steering wheel, guiding the truck back toward the access road. The creature made a sound, a strange chittering vocalization that might have been pain or fear or both. Jake risked a glance and saw that the alien's injured leg was leaving purple blood on his passenger seat. They hit the highway doing 50 miles per hour, the truck's suspension bottoming out with a bone-jarring impact. Jake turned east, away from civilization, driving as fast as the ancient engine would allow. In his rearview mirror, he could see the black SUVs emerging from the desert, beginning their pursuit. They were newer, faster, and undoubtedly equipped with communications technology that would bring reinforcements. Jake's truck had a top speed of maybe 85 miles per hour with a tailwind, and they were already low on gas. The creature beside him made another sound, this one different, longer, more modulated, almost like speech but in frequencies that seemed to vibrate Jake's bones. It reached out with one long-fingered hand and touched the dashboard radio. Immediately, the dead radio sparked to life, glowing with an eerie green light. Static poured from the speakers, then resolved into sounds that weren't quite words, but seemed to carry meaning nonetheless. "What are you doing?" Jake asked, knowing the creature probably couldn't understand him. But those enormous eyes turned to look at him, and Jake had the unsettling sensation that the creature understood far more than it could communicate. The radio sounds changed, becoming more intense. The truck's engine, which had been running rough for months, suddenly smoothed out, purring like it was brand new. The speedometer needle climbed 90, 95, 100 miles per hour. The desert flew past in a blur. "Holy hell," Jake whispered. "What are you?" The creature's wide mouth opened slightly, not quite a smile, but perhaps the alien equivalent. It touched its chest with one scaled hand, then pointed that same hand toward the darkening eastern sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. The message was clear enough: not from here. The black SUVs were falling behind now, unable to match their enhanced speed. But Jake knew this was temporary. They would have helicopters, roadblocks, satellite tracking. You didn't deploy a tactical team with lethal force authorization unless you had serious resources behind you. Whoever wanted this creature back had the power to make Jake and his passenger disappear permanently. As full darkness fell over the desert, Jake kept driving into the unknown, his life irrevocably changed by a choice he still couldn't fully explain. Behind them, the burning crash site receded into memory. Ahead, the night offered no answers, only questions that grew more terrifying with each passing mile. And beside him sat a being from another world, bleeding and vulnerable, who had somehow chosen to trust the one human who'd been crazy enough to help. Jake drove through the night, avoiding the interstate and keeping the back roads that snaked through the empty desert landscape. The creature beside him had fallen into a state that might have been sleep or unconsciousness. Jake couldn't tell which. Its breathing had slowed to something almost imperceptible, and the purple blood had stopped flowing from its leg wound, though the alien scales in that area had darkened to nearly black. Around 3 a.m, Jake pulled off onto an abandoned mining road and killed the engine. They were somewhere in the hills east of the San Carlos Apache Reservation, miles from the nearest town. The silence of the desert at night was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant howl of a coyote. Jake's mind raced with questions that had no answers. What had he gotten himself into? Who were those tactical operators? Government? Military? Some private corporation? And most importantly, what exactly was this creature beside him, and why were they so desperate to capture it? As if sensing his thoughts, the alien stirred. Those enormous black eyes opened, focusing on Jake with unnerving intensity. The creature straightened in the seat, wincing as it moved its injured leg. Then it did something completely unexpected. It reached out and placed one long-fingered hand on Jake's forearm. The moment they made contact, Jake's world exploded with sensation. Images flooded his mind, not words, but pure visual and emotional information transmitted directly into his consciousness. He saw vast cities of crystalline towers reaching into alien skies, civilizations millions of years old, ships that moved between stars like children skipping stones across a pond. He felt loneliness, curiosity, and a desperate, urgent warning. Then the images focused. Jake saw Earth from space, beautiful and blue and fragile. He saw ships approaching not friendly explorers but something else, something predatory. Scouts, advanced forces for something much larger. The reptilian species, the creature called its kind the Veshkai, had been monitoring humanity for decades, watching from the shadows, trying to decide whether humans were ready for contact or if they needed more time to evolve past their violent tendencies. But something had gone wrong. A Veshkai scout ship had been detected and shot down by a secret government program that had been hunting for extraterrestrial contact for 30 years. The crash Jake had witnessed wasn't an accident. It was the result of an electromagnetic pulse weapon designed specifically to disable alien technology. And the tactical team wasn't trying to capture the alien for scientific study. They were trying to capture it for something much darker, reverse engineering its biology to create weapons and enhancements for human soldiers. The creature Jake learned its name was something like Saratha, Though human vocal cords couldn't properly pronounce it, had been sending distress signals since the crash. Signals that would be received by other Veshkai ships, who would come looking for their missing scout. If they arrived and found one of their own had been captured, tortured, and dissected by humans, first contact would not be peaceful. It would be a preemptive strike against a species deemed too dangerous to exist. Jake jerked his hand away, breaking the connection. He was breathing hard, his mind reeling from the information dump. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "You're saying if they catch you, it'll start a war?" Saratha made that chittering sound again, then touched the radio once more. This time, the static resolved into something different sounds that Jake's brain somehow interpreted as yes. Danger, and a concept that roughly translated to extinction-level event. "We need to get you back to your people," Jake said, though he had no idea how to accomplish that. "How do we do that? Where do we go?" The alien reached into a pouch on its side. Jake hadn't even noticed it was wearing something like a utility belt, and withdrew a small device about the size of a smartphone, but made of that same color-shifting metal as the crashed ship. Saratha's fingers moved across its surface, and a holographic display appeared in the air between them, showing a three-dimensional map of the region. A pulsing point of light indicated their current location, and another point, this one in steady green, marked a spot about 200 miles southeast, near the border with Mexico. More images flooded Jake's mind through proximity alone. No touch needed this time. He saw a hidden Veshkai base, camouflaged in the desert, where a transport ship was stationed. If they could reach it, Saratha could be extracted, and the crisis might be averted. But the tactical team Jake now understood they were part of an organization called UMBRA, a black-budget program so secret that most government officials didn't know it existed, would be tracking them using satellite thermal imaging, and probably had the entire region locked down. 200 miles, Jake said, calculating. That's through some of the most remote desert in North America. No cover from satellites, probably checkpoints on every road by now. He looked at the alien, who stared back with those impossibly deep eyes. "This is insane. We'll never make it." But even as he said it, Jake knew he was going to try. Not because he was brave or heroic, he'd never been either of those things, but because for the first time since his father's death, since losing the ranch, since becoming just another piece of human wreckage discarded by an uncaring system, Jake Mitchell had a purpose, something that mattered, something bigger than himself. Saratha seemed to understand his decision without Jake speaking it aloud. The alien reached out again, this time with both hands, and placed them on either side of Jake's head. The sensation was overwhelming warmth, gratitude, and something else that Jake could only describe as kinship. Two beings from different worlds, both outcasts in their own way, both running from forces that wanted to use them up and throw them away. When Saratha pulled back, Jake found himself smiling for the first time in months. "All right," he said, starting the engine. "Let's go save the world. Or at least prevent it from being destroyed. Same thing, right?" As they pulled back onto the road, heading south into even more remote territory, Jake noticed something strange. The truck's gas gauge, which had been sitting on empty for the last hour, was now reading half full. He glanced at Saratha, who made a sound that Jake was beginning to interpret as amusement. "You can manipulate energy, can't you?" Jake asked. "The engine, the fuel, the radio, that's how your ships work?" The alien nodded, then pointed forward, urging haste. Because somewhere behind them, UMBRA was mobilizing everything they had to find one crashed alien and the cowboy foolish enough to help it. And ahead of them, 200 miles of hostile terrain waited. Along with questions about whether humanity was ready to learn, it wasn't alone in the universe, and whether that knowledge would save the species or doom it. Dawn broke over the desert in shades of pink and gold, beautiful and merciless. Jake had been driving for 7 hours straight. Fueled by adrenaline and cheap gas station coffee, he grabbed during a risky stop in a tiny settlement called Mammoth. His eyes burned with fatigue, and his back ached from the truck's worn seats, but stopping wasn't an option. The holographic map that Saratha periodically projected showed they'd covered about 130 miles, which meant they were roughly 2/3 of the way to the extraction point. But it also showed something terrifying. UMBRA forces were converging on their position from multiple directions. The tactical teams had been reinforced with what appeared to be drone support, and several roadblocks had been established on the major routes heading south. Jake's only advantage was local knowledge. He'd spent 30 years in this region, knew every dirt road and dried riverbed, every forgotten mining trail and abandoned homestead. As the sun climbed higher, Jake navigated through increasingly rough terrain. The truck bounced violently over rocks and through arroyos, pushing the ancient suspension to its limits. Twice they had to backtrack when roads became impassable, losing precious time. Saratha remained alert, using the alien device to scan for threats, occasionally touching the dashboard to coax more power from the failing engine. Around mid-morning, disaster struck. They crested a rise to find a checkpoint ahead, 2 UMBRA vehicles blocking the road, armed personnel visible. Jake slammed on the brakes, throwing the truck into reverse, but it was too late. They'd been spotted. Shouts erupted from the checkpoint, and one of the vehicles started moving to pursue. "Hold on." Jake yanked the steering wheel, sending the truck careening off the road and down a steep embankment. For a moment, they were airborne, the world tilting crazily. They hit the bottom with a bone-jarring crash that cracked the windshield and sent both Jake and Saratha lurching against their seatbelts. The engine sputtered and died. Jake turned the key frantically. Nothing. The truck was finally done, pushed beyond its limits. Through the shattered rear window, he could see the UMBRA vehicles repositioning at the top of the embankment, preparing to come down after them. Saratha grabbed Jake's shoulder and pointed toward a narrow canyon about 50 yards away. They abandoned the truck, Jake grabbing his shotgun and the alien's device, and ran for cover. The canyon entrance was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, opening into a maze of sandstone passages carved by millions of years of water erosion. They went deep, Jake letting Saratha lead since the alien's device seemed capable of mapping the passages ahead. Behind them, they could hear UMBR forces entering the canyon, calling for them to surrender, promising they wouldn't be harmed, promises Jake knew were lies. The passages twisted and turned, sometimes opening into larger chambers, sometimes narrowing so much they had to move sideways. Jake's shirt was soaked with sweat, and his throat burned with thirst. They'd left their water in the truck. Saratha's wounded leg was clearly bothering the alien again, slowing their pace. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes, they emerged from the canyon into a hidden valley Jake had never seen before. A natural spring fed a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees, and ancient petroglyphs covered the rock wall's human markings hundreds or thousands of years old. But there were other symbols too, ones that matched the script on Saratha's device. The Veshkai had been here before, long before. Jake collapsed by the pool and drank deeply, the cold water like salvation. Saratha knelt beside him, also drinking, then began tending to its wounded leg. The alien produced a small tube from its pouch and applied a luminescent gel to the injury. The darkened scales immediately began to lighten, and the wound started visibly healing. "Advanced civilization?" Jake muttered. "Medical technology we probably won't have for centuries. And we're trying to capture you to cut you apart and steal your secrets." But Saratha's eyes weren't showing defeat. They were showing resolve. The alien stood, stepping out from behind the boulder into full view of the tactical teams. Every weapon immediately trained on it. The commander raised her hand, signaling her people to hold fire. "Specimen secure," the commander said into her radio. "Prepare tranquilizer rounds. We're taking it alive." Jake's mind raced. There had to be some way out of this. And then he noticed something strange. Saratha wasn't afraid. The alien was standing calmly, one hand on the device at its belt, fingers moving across the surface in deliberate patterns. What was it doing? The answer came 5 seconds later when every electronic device in the valley simultaneously activated. The helicopter's engines roared to maximum power without anyone touching the controls. Tactical radios screamed with feedback. Weapon targeting systems went haywire. The commander's megaphone blared static so loud it forced her to drop it. And from Saratha's device, a pulse of energy erupted, not visible light, but something Jake felt in his bones. It washed over the valley like a wave, and every human except Jake stumbled, disoriented, their weapons falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. Jake realized what had happened, some kind of electromagnetic pulse specifically tuned to affect human nervous systems, inducing temporary paralysis. Saratha gestured urgently toward the helicopter. They ran together, Jake climbing into the pilot's seat while Saratha took the co-pilot position. Jake had flown helicopters exactly once in his life, a joyride his father had paid for on his 16th birthday. But how hard could it be? Very hard, it turned out. The helicopter lifted off jerkily, spinning wildly as Jake fought with the controls. Behind them, UMBRA forces were already starting to recover, staggering to their feet, reaching for weapons. Bullets pinged off the helicopter's hull as Jake finally got the aircraft somewhat under control and they lurched into the sky, gaining altitude. "Okay," Jake shouted over the roar of the engines. "Now, we just need to fly 70 miles without crashing, avoid getting shot down, and reach your extraction point. Easy." Saratha made that sound that might have been laughter or terror or both. The alien reached out and touched the helicopter's control panel, and suddenly the aircraft smoothed out, flying with inhuman precision as Saratha integrated with its systems. A holographic display appeared, showing their route to the extraction point, and more alarmingly showing 4 other UMBRA helicopters converging on their position. They were in the endgame now. 70 miles in less than an hour stood between first contact and catastrophe, between understanding and war, between one frightened cowboy and one injured alien, proving that maybe, just maybe, humanity deserved a chance to join the wider universe. The desert flew beneath them as they raced the setting sun toward whatever destiny awaited at the end of this impossible journey. But Saratha's eyes weren't showing defeat. They were showing resolve. The alien stood, stepping out from behind the boulder into full view of the tactical teams. Every weapon immediately trained on it. The commander raised her hand, signaling her people to hold fire. "Specimen secure," the commander said into her radio. "Prepare tranquilizer rounds. We're taking it alive." Jake's mind raced. There had to be some way out of this. And then he noticed something strange. Saratha wasn't afraid. The alien was standing calmly, one hand on the device at its belt, fingers moving across the surface in deliberate patterns. What was it doing? The answer came 5 seconds later when every electronic device in the valley simultaneously activated. The helicopter's engines roared to maximum power without anyone touching the controls. Tactical radios screamed with feedback. Weapon targeting systems went haywire. The commander's megaphone blared static so loud it forced her to drop it. And from Saratha's device, a pulse of energy erupted, not visible light, but something Jake felt in his bones. It washed over the valley like a wave, and every human except Jake stumbled, disoriented, their weapons falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. Jake realized what had happened, some kind of electromagnetic pulse specifically tuned to affect human nervous systems, inducing temporary paralysis. Saratha gestured urgently toward the helicopter. They ran together, Jake climbing into the pilot's seat while Saratha took the co-pilot position. Jake had flown helicopters exactly once in his life, a joyride his father had paid for on his 16th birthday. But how hard could it be? Very hard, it turned out. The helicopter lifted off jerkily, spinning wildly as Jake fought with the controls. Behind them, UMBR forces were already starting to recover, staggering to their feet, reaching for weapons. Bullets pinged off the helicopter's hull as Jake finally got the aircraft somewhat under control, and they lurched into the sky, gaining altitude. "Okay," Jake shouted over the roar of the engines. "Now, we just need to fly 70 miles without crashing, avoid getting shot down, and reach your extraction point. Easy." Saratha made that sound that might have been laughter or terror or both. The alien reached out and touched the helicopter's control panel, and suddenly the aircraft smoothed out, flying with inhuman precision as Saratha integrated with its systems. A holographic display appeared, showing their route to the extraction point, and more alarmingly showing 4 other UMBRA helicopters converging on their position. They were in the endgame now. 70 miles in less than an hour stood between first contact and catastrophe, between understanding and war, between one frightened cowboy and one injured alien, proving that maybe, just maybe, humanity deserved a chance to join the wider universe. The desert flew beneath them as they raced the setting sun toward whatever destiny awaited at the end of this impossible journey. The canyon opened into a larger chamber, a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering walls of striated rock. And there, camouflaged so perfectly Jake had almost missed it, sat the Veshkai ship. It was larger than the crashed scout vessel, maybe 60 feet across, with a gracefully curved hull that seemed to shimmer and shift, making it difficult to look at directly. As their helicopter approached, the ship's camouflage deactivated, revealing smooth metallic surfaces inscribed with that same flowing alien script. A hatch opened on the ship's underside, a ramp extending. Saratha made urgent chittering sounds, pointing down. Jake brought the helicopter into a hover as close to the ship as he dared, maybe 10 feet off the ground. The UMBRA helicopters burst into the amphitheater behind them, weapon systems activating. "Go!" Jake shouted. "Get to your ship." But Saratha grabbed Jake's arm, those alien eyes boring into his. Images flooded Jake's consciousness, a choice being offered. Come with us. Leave Earth behind. See the universe. Live among the stars. For a moment, Jake was tempted. What was there to return to? Poverty? Loneliness? A world that had chewed him up and spit him out? But then he thought of the desert he'd grown up in, the cattle he'd raised, his father's weathered hands teaching him to rope and ride. Earth was flawed, violent, messy, but it was home. And maybe humanity needed people who'd seen what he'd seen, who understood what was at stake, to help guide it toward being ready for the stars. "I can't," Jake said, pulling his arm free. "My place is here. But you go get out of here before they shoot us both down." Saratha hesitated for only a heartbeat, then did something completely unexpected. The alien pressed its forehead against Jake's, a gesture of respect, of farewell, of profound connection between two souls who'd shared an impossible journey. Then Saratha leaped from the helicopter, landing gracefully despite the injured leg, and sprinted toward the Veshkai ship. The UMBRA helicopters opened fire. Bullets tore through the air, kicking up dust around Saratha's feet. Jake swung the helicopter around, putting it between the alien and the gunfire, taking hits meant for his friend. Alarms screamed as the aircraft took damage. The engine coughed, black smoke pouring from somewhere behind him. Saratha reached the ramp and turned back one final time, raising a hand in a gesture that transcended species. "Goodbye. Thank you. I won't forget." Then the alien disappeared into the ship. The Veshkai vessel came alive, humming with power that made Jake's teeth ache. Energy crackled across its hull, building to something massive. The UMBRA helicopters tried to reposition, tried to bring heavier weapons to bear, but they were too slow. A pulse of blue-white light erupted from the Veshkai ship, not a weapon, but pure propulsion energy. The craft shot straight upward with impossible acceleration, going from stationary to supersonic in the span of a single second. The shockwave it created slammed into everything in the canyon, flipping Jake's damaged helicopter end over end, sending the UMBR aircraft spinning wildly out of control. Jake fought with the controls as the helicopter plummeted, rotating like a falling leaf. The ground rushed up to meet him. 20 feet. 10. 5. He was going to die here, in this nameless canyon, and nobody would ever know what had really happened. But then, impossibly, the helicopter's descent slowed. Jake felt an external force grab the aircraft, cushioning its fall. He crashed into the canyon floor, but at a survivable speed. Metal crumpled around him, glass shattered, and pain exploded through his ribs, but he was alive. Jake crawled from the wreckage, gasping, tasting blood. Around him, the UMBRA helicopters were landing hard, damaged by the shockwave, but not destroyed. Operators were already disembarking, weapons raised, converging on his position. But they were all looking up, transfixed by what they saw in the sky. The Veshkai ship hovered 1,000 feet above the canyon, no longer camouflaged but fully visible in all its alien glory. And it was broadcasting, not in words, but in pure conceptual information that every human consciousness in the area could somehow perceive and understand. The message was simple but profound. We are here. We have always been here, watching, waiting, hoping you would be ready. One of our own crashed, not by accident but by your violence. But one of you chose compassion over fear. One of you proved that humanity contains the potential for wisdom. We are leaving now, but we will return in 1 generation. Prove yourselves worthy of the stars, or remain alone in the darkness. The choice is yours. Images accompanied the message visions of what humanity could become if it chose cooperation over conflict. Cities of light and learning, ships exploring distant galaxies, humans working alongside 100 different alien species to unravel the mysteries of the universe. But also visions of the alternative, a species locked in endless cycles of violence, destroying itself before it ever reached the stars. A cautionary tale whispered among the galactic community. Then the ship was gone, accelerating beyond the speed of sound, beyond sight, leaving only a sonic boom and a sky full of witnesses who would never be able to deny what they'd seen. The UMBRA commander stood frozen, staring at the empty sky where the ship had been. A radio was going crazy with reports. The broadcast had been received across the entire American Southwest by every human consciousness within a 300-mile radius. Military bases, Native American reservations, cities, towns, ranches. Millions of people had just experienced direct alien contact. There would be no cover-up, no denying what had happened. First contact had occurred, not in the controlled, managed way UMBRA had wanted, but messily, chaotically, human. And it had happened because one broke cowboy with nothing to lose had chosen to do the right thing when it mattered most. The commander turned to look at Jake, who was leaning against a rock, holding his probably broken ribs. Her expression was unreadable anger, awe, fear, wonder, all mixed together. "What have you done?" she whispered. Jake coughed, tasted more blood, but managed a painful smile. "I gave us a chance," he said. "Now it's up to everyone else to decide if we deserve it." The aftermath was chaos, but not the kind Jake had expected. Umbra tried to contain the story, to spin it as mass hallucination or atmospheric phenomena, but you couldn't cover up something experienced by millions of people simultaneously. Within hours, cell phone footage flooded the internet, shaky videos of the Veshkai ship ascending, of the blue-white light, of people standing transfixed as alien concepts flooded their consciousness. The government initially denied everything, then grudgingly acknowledged an event of unknown origin. But the denials rang hollow when thousands of witnesses from every walk of life described identical experiences. Scientists, teachers, truck drivers, children, all telling the same story of the message, the choice, the ultimatum. Jake spent 3 days in federal custody being debriefed by everyone from Air Force intelligence to NASA administrators. They wanted to know everything about Saratha, about the technology, about what the alien had communicated. Jake told them the truth, though he could see in their eyes that many didn't want to believe that first. Contact had hinged on the conscience of one unremarkable cowboy. On the 4th day, they released him. No charges were filed, partly because charging him would require acknowledging the existence of programs that were supposed to remain classified, and partly because Jake had become something unexpected, a folk hero. Social media had identified him as the cowboy who saved first contact, and his story had gone viral. People saw in him something they desperately wanted to believe, that individual choices mattered, that compassion could triumph over institutional violence, that humanity might actually be worthy of the stars. Jake returned to Arizona, to the desert that had shaped him. His truck was impounded as evidence, probably never to be seen again. But the unexpected publicity had brought unexpected opportunities. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell his story. A book publisher offered an advance. Speaking invitations poured in from universities and conferences. But more importantly, something had shifted in the collective consciousness. The xenophobic panic that many had predicted never materialized. Instead, there was a global conversation about what kind of species humanity wanted to be. The Veshkai had given them one generation, roughly 30 years, to prove themselves. That meant children being born today would grow up knowing they were being evaluated by alien observers, knowing their choices and their civilization's choices would determine humanity's place in the cosmos. Jake stood on what had been his father's ranch, now owned by the bank, but scheduled to be converted into a nature preserve. The desert stretched endlessly before him, just as it always had, but it felt different now. The stars weren't just distant lights anymore. They were destinations, possibilities, homes to civilizations that had mastered the very challenges humanity still struggled with. His phone buzzed another interview request, this one from the United Nations First Contact Working Group, an international body that had been hastily assembled to coordinate humanity's response to the Veshkai ultimatum. They wanted Jake to serve as a special advisor, bringing his unique perspective to discussions about preparing for the return. Jake smiled, thinking about how far he'd come from being a broke cowboy sleeping in his truck. But the truth was, he hadn't changed at all. He was still the same man who'd made a split-second decision to help someone in need, regardless of the consequences. That was all it had taken. Not special knowledge or exceptional courage, just basic human decency at a critical moment. 3 months after the event, on a clear desert night, Jake was camping in the Box Canyon where the Veshkai ship had been hidden. NASA had set up monitoring equipment in the area, hoping to detect any additional alien activity, and they'd invited Jake to join the observation team. Around midnight, as Jake sat by the campfire watching the stars, every electronic device in the canyon suddenly activated. Radios, computers, phones, all broadcasting the same signal. Jake's heart raced as he recognized the pattern of modulations, the same voice that had spoken through his truck's radio. The message was brief, directed specifically at Jake through frequencies only his brain seemed able to interpret. "Thank you, friend Jake. You gave us hope for your species. We are watching. We believe in you. Tell them to choose wisely." Then, as quickly as it had come, the signal vanished. But Jake noticed something strange. His phone's photo gallery had a new image he hadn't taken. It showed Saratha standing in what appeared to be a Veshkai city, those alien towers reaching into purple skies. The being was holding up one hand in that universal gesture of farewell and friendship. And somehow, impossibly, Saratha seemed to be smiling. Jake stared at the image for a long time, then looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, his friend was home, safe, healing. And somewhere out there, other Veshkai were watching Earth, waiting to see if humanity would rise to the challenge or fall to its worst impulses. The next generation would decide. Children not yet born would inherit a world that knew it wasn't alone, that understood the universe was vast and full of wonders and terrors beyond imagining. They would grow up with the knowledge that their choices mattered not just for Earth, but for humanity's place in a galactic community millions of years old. Jake thought about his father, about the ranch he'd lost, about how close he'd come to giving up entirely. If he'd driven past that burning crash site, if he'd chosen safety over conscience, if he'd let fear guide him instead of compassion, none of this would have happened. First contact might have occurred through violence and domination, confirming humanity's worst nature. Instead, it had happened through an act of simple kindness. One man helping another being in distress, species be damned. Jake added another log to the fire and pulled out his journal. He'd started writing everything down, not for the documentaries or the books, but because he wanted to remember every detail. He wanted future generations to understand that the fate of civilizations could turn on the smallest moments, the quietest choices. As he wrote, the desert wind carried whispers of possibility. 30 years, one generation. Time enough for humanity to heal old wounds, bridge ancient divides, learn to see itself not as competing nations and tribes, but as one species taking its first tentative steps toward the stars. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, conflicts, people who chose fear over hope. But Jake had seen something in Saratha's eyes that final moment before the alien departed belief. Belief that humanity had the potential to transcend its violent past and become something greater. The Veshkai were patient. They had waited for humanity before, watching from the shadows as civilizations rose and fell, always hoping that eventually the younger species would be ready. They could wait another generation. The question was, could humanity use that time wisely? Jake closed his journal and looked up at the endless canopy of stars, each one a sun with worlds of its own. Perhaps with civilizations asking the same questions, making the same choices. The universe was vast beyond comprehension, but it had reached down and touched one small corner of the Arizona desert, and nothing would ever be the same. In one generation, the Veshkai would return, not as conquerors or saviors, but as equals if humanity proved itself worthy. Teachers, friends, partners in exploring the infinite mysteries of existence. Or they would arrive to find a species that had failed the test, still locked in cycles of violence and fear, not ready for the responsibility that came with joining the galactic community. Jake Mitchell, the cowboy who had protected an alien and changed the course of human history, sat alone under the stars and felt the weight of that future pressing down on every decision. Every choice, every act of kindness or cruelty that would be made in the years to come. The countdown had begun. 30 years, one generation. Time would tell if humanity deserved the stars. But tonight, in this moment, Jake allowed himself to hope. Because if one broke cowboy could make a difference, then maybe, just maybe 8 billion humans working together can achieve something truly extraordinary. The fire crackled. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. And somewhere in the vast darkness between worlds, the Veshkai watched and waited, hoping that the species they'd found in the desert would prove worthy of the gift they'd been given. A second chance, a clear choice, and all the time in the world to become something better than they were. Jake smiled, finished his coffee, and settled in for a long night of stargazing. After all, those distant lights weren't just stars anymore. They were neighbors. Family, perhaps, waiting for humanity to grow up enough to join them at the table. And that, Jake thought, was worth protecting, worth fighting for. worth every impossible choice he made on one desperate night when a poor cowboy had decided that kindness mattered more than fear. The universe had noticed. Now came the hard part, living up to it.